For a lot of the vehicles in this series, you can kind of understand why they maybe failed, or were forgotten, or just aren't talked about more. Take last week, for instance, the Skoda Felicia VR6. It wasn't a failure by any stretch, because they didn't even try to produce it, but it's understandable why a car like that wouldn't be talked about all the time. It's a Skoda, it's a small hatchback, and it has a pretty cool engine, but beyond that, it's not exactly going to rock the world. Other times, though, there are cars which definitely do deserve to be talked about more. And for me, my favourite episode of this whole series was the Pontoon Can-Am race car from probably a couple of dozen episodes back now. But that car is so radically different and yet doesn't have anywhere near the kind of exposure that certain racing games such as Gran Turismo have given cars like the Chaparral 2J or various others that do have a lot of exposure, that are talked about a lot, because to me, stuff like the Pontoon Can-Am car, even though it was objectively a failure, which by the way, so was the Chaparral, it never even won a race, that's not fair to me, because those amazing cars go above and beyond just being forgotten. They are really impressive, and to me this is a third perfect example of that alongside the Chaparral and that Pontoon Can-Am car. The car here is technically more than one that we're going to talk about. We might go more in depth into certain vehicles mentioned in this episode in the future, but for now, we're going to take an overarching look at this vehicle. Now, the car in particular is called the Bisiluro TARF, or the TARF Bisiluro technically. And there were different versions of the car, even other companies making homages to it, taking the concept and trying to run with it, and we're going to mention those briefly throughout the episode. Now, before we get into the first iteration of the car itself, we need to talk about the guy behind it. Now, his name was Piero Taruffi, and he was a racing driver from 1930 to 1957. That was his racing career, and he was very successful. Numerous wins. He raced for Mercedes, Maserati, Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, and he had, as I said, multiple victories. He won the Panamericana in 51, the Mille Miglia even in 57, and he also wrote 2 books about racing. He was an industrial engineer, and he also had a brainchild, as certain race drivers have when it comes to designing their own vehicles. We've seen it before, especially in more modern times. Mosler, Callaway, various others, Noble being one of the most successful examples with multiple different cars there, from Ascari, Noble, various other iterations. This one is much less talked about and much less known. And part of that comes from its era. It's such an old vehicle compared to many of those modern examples. Now, his idea was to make a car which was this Bisiluro design, because what that means in Italian is twin torpedo, or two torpedo. That is an interesting concept, and when you see the car in this video, it certainly stands out. It's a very memorable looking design, and chances are if you've googled weird cars on the internet before, you've probably seen this one pop up, or some version of it. But it doesn't necessarily look like a good idea. It looks like a very, very flimsy little car, which might just break apart mid-race. Again, referencing stuff like that Pontoon Can-Am, a car which was technically so good that it became bad. It's a weird loop that can happen, almost a paradox. This one is the exact opposite, funnily enough. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It pioneered this kind of design, to the point where it did undergo multiple different variations, as I said, and actually broke numerous records. Now, the first vehicle was built in 1948, the TARF 1. It was powered by a very small half-a-litre or 500cc Guzzi V-twin engine, only 50 horsepower, which of course in 1948 doesn't sound as bad as it would now, but still that's not a huge amount of power to work with. However, with 50 horsepower, that car could hit 130 miles per hour. That is very impressive, especially for 1948. For a car in general back then, that's really good, but for a car with barely any power, that's even more impressive. Now, he patented a design which he never actually used called the Trisiluro. Now, Bisiluro, or Bisiluro, as I said, means twin torpedo. So, Trisiluro, or Trisiluro, of course, by nature of the name, means 3 torpedoes. As I said, he patented this 3-torpedo design, but as far as anyone knows, he never actually built one, which is unfortunate. I would have liked to have seen what that car could have done, considering it would doubtless have been even more stable, probably with a central driving position, slightly more conventional. This one, though, had a fairly obvious layout when you look at the car, of having the engine on one side and the driver on the other. So the weight difference isn't too ridiculous, but considering the sizes of the engines, that could very easily change. You slap a big V8 in it and you can notice a difference real fast. Now, the second version, the TARF 2, built in 1951, so only a couple of years later, really upped the ante. Instead of that half-a-litre V-twin engine, it had a 1.7-litre straight 4 from a Maserati, and instead of 50 horsepower, it has 290, which is mad for a car like this. Could it handle it? Well, yeah, boy could it handle it, because this car went on to break so many different records between 1951 and 1957, even with multiple engine changes throughout that time, including setting a running mile record of 185 miles per hour and a running kilometre at 180 miles per hour. That's insane. Imagine sitting in this thing and doing 185 miles per hour. I'll tell you what, I would never do that in this car. As much as I love it, it looks terrifying. I would just have visions constantly of it splitting in half at those twig-esque connections between the two body panels or the two body sections. But it wasn't just about the aerodynamics. This car had so many impressive things for the time. That version from 1951 in particular, the TARF 2, also had independent suspension. It had chain drive, interestingly, between, of course, the engine and the rear wheels. And it even had adjustable rear fins, which the original one did not have, to improve even more the aerodynamics. It's funny, we look at modern day LMP cars, Le Mans prototypes, and in the past few years especially, they've introduced the shark fin, and we even see that in Formula racing as well. We think of that as being this cool thing. This car did it in 1951, and of course there were even earlier examples than that, but having adjustable ones is relatively rare. It tends to be more of the Jaguar D-type deal, where it's just a fixed buttress kind of design behind the driver's head. Whereas this one was kind of like active aero, although of course it didn't change in driving. You'd set it before the race or before the run, and then it stayed like that. Now, speaking of racing, that was exactly what Taruffi wanted to do with this car. He wanted to race it in a wide variety of things. He was quoted as saying that the importance of my car is that it embodies many new principles that will become standard in automobiles 10 years from now. And that was in 1952, so of course it didn't happen. But that's the weird thing. For a car that accomplished so much, even in just a couple of years, it is strange that it didn't become more common. Now, I spoke earlier on about a couple of different versions that tried to be made or tried to use the same idea, and probably the most notable is a red 1955 car built by Carlo Molino using the same technology, but with a slightly more tough looking body, you could say, but being a very vague sense with a design like this, and he ran it at Le Mans. Now, the car didn't fare too well, which certainly didn't help, but plenty of cars with conventional designs don't fare well at Le Mans. That's kind of the nature of the race. Taruffi himself even wanted to run the car in the Indy 500 with a 4.5-litre Ferrari engine. Imagine how mad that would be. Now, doubtless that would have had even more radical aero to keep it under control, but the fact that after driving the first one in 48 and then the faster one in 51 and continuing to refine it over the years, he still wanted to put that 4.5-litre engine in there, that kind of tells you something. He must have had confidence in it, and it must have felt at least pretty stable for him to have that kind of confidence. Because to jump from a 0.5 litre to 1.7 is one thing. To jump from a 1.7 to a 4.5, that is a massive difference. That engine could have easily added another 100 to 200 horsepower over what it had before. This would have easily exceeded 200 miles per hour. And in a car that looks like this, that would have been even more terrifying than it already was, potentially. Now, that wasn't the last time somebody built an homage to it. In 1967, a brand called OSI built a car called the Silver Fox, which essentially looks kind of like this crossed with the Delta Wing, because it has a roof, but very clear clearly is inspired by it. That also went nowhere. It wasn't a production vehicle. And that's the funny thing. The reason why this is an unsung hero is so vague. It seems so strange to me, because the car's name isn't all that difficult to spell or to remember. So it's not like some Russo-Baltique crazy hypercar concept that just gets forgotten because it's so mad. This has a name that's easy to Google, it has a design that's hard to forget, and it accomplished so much. And yet it is, for the most part, still such an obscure car. That makes no sense to me. With some cars it does, but with others like this one, it really is strange how it's not talked about more. It deserves to be. Of course, that's why it's here. And some cars, definitely more than others, really do bring out that passion for me. Because this one, I mean, come on, of course it deserves to be talked about more. It's an awesome little machine that accomplished almost everything it set out to do. Apart from actually winning a race or ending up in the Indy, it set so many records. It went from strength to strength in terms of performance. It proved that his concept was sound. And that's the strangest part, because even after all that, nobody took up the design in a production sense or trying to develop it beyond the late 50s or even the 1967 concept. It pretty much just died after that. Now, speaking to what actually happened to the car, in 1986 it was shipped to Australia and fitted with a V6 Dino engine instead. And then in 2012, which is the most recent research I did on it, according to Hemmings, it sold at an auction for $115,000, which seems kind of insanely cheap for a car like this. Which incidentally was a lot lower than they expected it to get. They thought it would get more like $200,000. So again, even when it comes to collectors and sales, it just doesn't have that respect. And that is a shame, because it's a great concept, truly a unique one, which looks like it shouldn't work, just like the aeroplane itself based on a bumblebee's wings looks like it shouldn't work, but look how amazing that is as well. You would think that a car like this would be one of the ultimate collector's pieces of the classic oddball racing world. It just isn't, for whatever reasons, and that's very strange to me. But certainly a car that deserves to be talked about here. Now, as far as discussing the Nardi 750 Bisiluro that raced in Le Mans in 55, the red one that I alluded to, we might cover that in its own episode, but I'm not sure, considering that a lot of the stuff would just reference this episode anyway. But as far as the 1967 Silver Fox, we might take a look at that one some point down the line. Or, of course, you could Google it yourself, which is the whole point of these episodes, to encourage people to look into these vehicles more, to talk about them more, to tell their friends about them, because these cars accomplish so much, in the case of this one for sure, and they deserve to be talked about because of that. But that's it for this episode. Of course, click through here at the end to see all of the previous episodes, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.